Hello and welcome to the module The Viking Age, the Scandinavian Homelands. Today we'll be investigating how we can define the Viking Age and how it began while linking it to long-term historical developments in ancient Scandinavia. Perhaps we should start by saying that the Viking Age is a modern historical construct used to describe quite a transformative period of roughly 3 centuries, generally spanning from the late 8th century to the late 11th century. While the term Viking, which would be Vikinger in Old Norse, originally denoted quite a specific activity, mainly referring to seaborne raiding activities, but it was also sort of like a social identity, modern scholars still tend to use the term Viking Age as a convenient label for every kind of activity that was undertaken by medieval Scandinavian peoples. Now, if we really want to be correct about the usage of the term, Viking should be used for those undertaking travels beyond Scandinavia, which is why we also have in modern historiography the term of Viking diaspora. However, even today, the term Viking tends to be used with the more broad meaning of Old Norse communities dwelling in this particular time. Um, we should also say that the period is generally said to have ended with the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which took place in 1066. It is the battle marking the death of the Norwegian king Haraldr Hardroda, so Harold Hardrada, and with it, the end of the large scale Viking invasions of England. However, things are far from simple because in other regions, such as the island of Gotland in Sweden, Viking style economies and cultural practices actually persisted until the 12th century. The beginnings, on the other hand, as we shall see, are even more convoluted and fascinating. If we were to describe the era, generally speaking, I think we should say that it was largely defined by the extraordinary maritime mobility of Scandinavians who basically transformed the political and cultural map of Europe through several key activities. First of all, we're dealing with early Reconnaissance raids, which transitioned gradually into large scale military campaigns by mobile pirate polities that operated largely independently from regional kings. This eventually led to the conquest of territories such as the Danelaw in England and Normandy in France. Furthermore, the Norse successfully settled previously uninhabited or sparsely populated lands in the North Atlantic, including the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, and also briefly reached the shores of North America, more specifically Newfoundland, around the year 1000. In the east, the Northmen became the Rus, establishing vast riverine networks through the land of Russia, connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Within Scandinavia, the era witnessed a transition from small, petty tribal chiefdoms into incipient, more or less unified kingdoms, alongside the gradual replacement of pagan beliefs with Christianity. One of the most interesting things to observe as a historian are the long term processes, which tend to mash up continuity and change. And this can be very well seen in our story, in the sense that the Viking Age is not really something that popped out of the blue, but it is rather a gradual process with evolutions occurring as far back as the Bronze Age. In the Nordic Bronze Age, which is a period spanning from about 1700 to 500 BC, we witness a sophisticated transition from a rather group oriented, relatively egalitarian structure of the Neolithic to a highly stratified warrior chiefdom system. This era was governed by prestige goods, where political economy was essentially maintained through the control of long distance trade, of maritime power, and also the public manifestation of heroic ideals. And this can be best seen in large burials as well as in rock art of the age. The early Bronze Age can be seen rather through the lens of communitas, so sort of like a ritual state where individuals were regarded equals regardless of their physical and marital status. However, this did give way to a ranked system of social inequality. Unlike the very stepped inequality of later periods, in the Bronze Age, the social differences are described in literature rather as ramped, indicating a ranked system where status was likely hereditary. By the late Bronze Age, society was divided into a noble class that resided in massive halls and a broader population of farmers living on smaller and scattered farmsteads. The economic and political engine of this sort of evolution was what we call the maritime mode of production. The system was driven by elite strategies to control trade and raid through ownership of advanced plank built vessels. The elites would finance long distance maritime expeditions to seek out metal sources, for example, in the British Isles and also in the Mediterranean, effectively bypassing middlemen and also hostiles. Scandinavia did lack some important resources like local metal ore and rather relied on other resources such as amber, which was considered the gold of the north, to function as sort of like a currency to fund society and acquire the bronze necessary for elite status symbols. The need to maintain these networks led to the formation of specific maritime institutions, which introduce a type of pan European code of warriorhood to the region. Militarism became the primary vehicle for expressing male social identity. That means the rise of a specialized class of warriors linked to the introduction of the bronze sword, which was the first weapon specifically designed only for combat against other humans. Elite status was communicated through conspicuous grooming as well. In a lot of graves, we are going to find stuff like tweezers, razors, combs, and so on. And yeah, we have this type of athletic warrior beauty being developed at the time. If we look at the rock art of the period, we are going to notice things like oversized phallic warriors equipped with weapons and horned helmets, which is something that we can link to the concept of hypermasculinity used to signify male societal ascendancy and potency. Some of these combat scenes would have been ritual, but we do have recent discoveries of killing scenes, such as those at the Tollensee Valley in northern Germany, suggesting that actual deadly violence and organized rivalry were quite common features of political life. The legitimacy of the ruling warrior elite was often tied to a concept classified as the stranger king. So, this would be largely the idea that power sort of like originates from some sort of supernatural world or from the wilderness. Political power might also have been split into a dual system in the sense that we would have had a chieftain that would have been specialized in religious attributes, like a high priest in charge of the peaceful productivity or fertility rituals, and at the same time we would also have a war chieftain embodying the creative, youthful violence, which is the concept of celeritas. This is a time where the ship also became a central emblem of an unequal society, where we have a small number of commanders directing a larger subordinate crew. By approximately 800 BC, there occurred a major shift in how power was manifested and envisioned. There was a move from we might call weak imagery, that would have been rather anonymous motifs, more standard motifs, to stronger imagery. That means detailed depictions of humans evoking more specific roles, aristocratic life, or some sort of mythological narrative. This period, in other words, saw the reinvention of using human representations to publicly manifest aristocratic ideals, thus reinforcing the status of subgroups through specific scenes of combat, for example, or riding, or going by ship, and so on. What is truly a monumental depiction of power, on the other hand, is the construction of the massive earthen barrows, so the burial mounds. And these would permanently mark the landscape, acting as anchors, as ancestral anchors, in the sense that families would use them to legitimize their claims for a particular land or power. Now, we can imagine these ruling elites as some sort of board members, if you will. They would have owned the fleet, so the maritime mode of production. They would have controlled the capital in the form of amber and bronze, and they would have also maintained a private security force in the shape of the warrior class. The status, on the other hand, was constantly advertised through this grand branding of monumental tombs and the dramatic, often violent commercials on this sort of rock art, which reminded all observers that their power was physically absolute, but at the same time, it was also divinely sanctioned. Moving forward to the Iron Age, this would have lasted in Scandinavia from about 500 BC to 700 AD. In this time, we can also notice an interesting change, which is a shift from rather autonomous tribal units in the Bronze Age to the emergence of more centralized structures. Political, economic, and sacred landscapes tended to merge as elite individuals consolidated authority through, again, the control of trade, through military prowess, and also different religious rituals. But this time, there is an essential difference, which is that iron was locally available in Scandinavia, especially in the form of bog iron. Now, this would have made the production of high quality tools and also weapons more accessible because it was less dependent on these fragile networks, international trade networks that essentially funded all of the Bronze Age prestige goods economies. However, this did not end international trade, not by a long shot, but it did mark again a shift, which this time focused toward Roman and continental luxury items. During the pre Roman Iron Age, society was predominantly rural and somewhat egalitarian, with the individual farmstead as the basic social unit. However, evidence from this period already suggests levels of organization a little above the household. First of all, this takes the shape of military collaboration. For example, the Yachtspring boat sacrifice, which took place in about 350 BC, contains the equipment of roughly 80 warriors. At the time, this would have been a force requiring the combined resources of several communities to muster. At the same time, there is evidence of massive defensive works, such as naval barricades in southern Öland in Denmark, documenting early collaborative efforts and the need for collective defense against maritime threats. By the end of the period, social stratification became more and more visible in villages such as Hodder, where one farmstead was significantly larger and more fortified than its neighbors. The influence of the Roman Empire, although never reaching Scandinavia militarily, was a major engine for social change. New elites began to rise. Power shifted from kin groups to leading clans and chiefs who acted in a way like managers of external relations. Wealthy princely graves, such as those at Hemingway and Hobby, contained luxury Roman goods like silver drinking sets and glass, which served as prestige symbols to legitimize the authority of the ones interred here. Rulers utilized network strategies, building power through personal connections, and this was done quite well through the practice of gift giving. At the same time, alliances spanning across Europe were being formed. Settlement patterns shifted as well from dispersed farms to more stable, planned villages like Forbassa, where individual farms were demarcated by fences, reflecting a new level of social order and also property rights. Between the 3rd and 6th century, so called central places also emerged as multifunctional hubs of economical, political, and religious heartlands of the region. And we have some examples at the sites of Gudme in Denmark and Uppåkra in Sweden. Now, excavations here clearly show that these were not simply settlements, but they were also some form of royal seats. They have enormous timber halls, also workshops and marketplaces, and in Uppåkra even a temple was uncovered here. So we can say that power was maintained by, for example, controlling specialized craft production, particularly gold, and also silver and iron, and also managing the distribution of these goods. The centers also included cultic practices. Again, Ubokra was a place that seems to have been used for centuries. We have centuries-old examples of sacrifices and animal sacrifices and weapon sacrifices, and this suggests that the elites held multiple roles, not only political leaders, but in a way they also acted as high priests, or at least they had some cultic attributes in order to maintain religious power in the area as well. The later Iron Age, including the Migration and the Vandal period, which is something we use to designate the decades briefly before the Viking Age, they were the final stages of consolidation into large political entities. The construction of massive royal mounds, such as the ones in Gamla Uppsala in Sweden or Borre in Norway, as well as the monumental halls up to 50 meters long, served as markers of dynastic claims to land and power. These new power centers also suffered from external climatic crises. The dust veil event from 536 led to widespread crop failure and also the abandonment of many settlements in middle Sweden, especially, potentially triggering a restructuring of society and an increase in ritual gold sacrifices to maybe appease the gods. By the end of the Germanic Iron Age, a somewhat unified Danish kingdom likely existed, capable of executing massive public works like the Danevirke Wall and the Samsø Canal, which required the coordination of a couple of thousand laborers. Conflict, on the other hand, was constant. It played a critical role in the evolution of political power. And for that, we have the evidence of a lot of weapon sacrifices in bogs, especially Ilehop, Nudem, and so on. And these reveal highly organized armies with apparently a three-tier military hierarchy. We have the common soldiers, the lower level officers, and also an elite command. The ability of a ruler to defeat an invading force of about 1,000 men and then ritually destroy their entire equipment was, in a way, the ultimate demonstration of dominance and also divine favor. So, in essence, the political evolution of the Iron Age had begun as isolated strands of tribal authority, gradually expanded into an interconnected network of alliances and trade, ultimately held together by a central magnate who sat at the heart of this complicated web and would control the flow of wealth, religion, and the military force of a particular region. The earliest glimpses of Germanic and Scandinavian peoples in the written sources are provided primarily by Greek and Roman geographers and historians. In his lost work Of the Ocean, Pytheas of Massalia, who lived in the 4th century BC, recorded a voyage to a land called Thule, generally identified with the west coast of Norway. He described, as expected, the inhabitants as barbarians who practiced agriculture, cultivated fruit and millet, and produced a fermented drink made of grain and honey. He also mentions the Teutones living near the amber-rich island of Abalus, as well as the Ingveones and the Goths under the name of Gutones, apparently. The tribes called Cimbri and Teutones in about 100 BC actually represent the first documented eruption of warlike northern peoples into continental Europe, engaging in very hostile contacts with Roman armies in Gaul, Spain, and Italy. The Teutones likely originated in Thy, so in Jutland in Denmark, while the Cimbri were from Himmerland, which is actually also a part of Jutland. The historian Orosius described the victory rites of the Cimbri at the Battle of Arausio, which took place in 105 BC, where they allegedly destroyed all the booty and executed the prisoners. The historian Strabo also recorded their priestesses performing human sacrifice over large bronze cauldrons. Poseidonius of Apamea, who wrote in about 130 BC, is the one credited with first using the collective term of Germani to describe the pressing southern migrating peoples. Historical records from the times of Emperors Augustus and Nero note that a Roman fleet reached the Kattegat Strait in 5 AD, receiving ambassadors from the Cimbri, Carudes, and Semnones, who requested Roman friendship. On the other hand, Pliny the Elder, writing in the first century AD in his Natural History, wrote of the Bay Codanus and a very large island he called Scandinavia. The historian Tacitus provides the first firm news of the Suiones, the Swedes of Uppland, describing them as a powerful tribe with great fleets of double-prowed ships and a supreme ruler with absolute power. He also mentions some neighbors, the Citones, whom he claimed were ruled by a woman. This is a potential reference to a land called Caenulas et Orquenas, appearing in very late legendary sagas. Ptolemy, writing in about 150 AD, described four islands named Scandia, identifying the Gautoi, the Goths, and the Cadenoi, possibly some peoples from Hedmark in Norway. He also noted the presence of the primitive, in quotation marks, Finns and Lapps to the north of these Germanic peoples. And then we have a long break and silence of the sources. Afterwards, late classical and early medieval authors tend to document what is known as the migration period, the Völkerwanderung. We have Jordanes, first and foremost, writing in about 550 AD, summarizing the lost work of Cassiodorus. And in his History of the Goths, he describes the big island of Skansa as a factory of peoples. He first provided the mention of the Dani, the Danes, noting that they were of the same stock as the Suechans, the Swedes, and also writes that they expelled the Eruli from these lands. He also lists numerous other communities, such as the Suetidi and several Norwegian groups like the Haroti from Hordaland or the Rugi from Rogaland. Procopius, writing in 550 AD, described Thule, the Scandinavian peninsula, as a place containing 13 nations, each with its own king. He also provided a vivid account of the Lapps, describing them as hunting peoples who fed their children on animal marrow rather than milk, probably to make them appear more monstrous. And then we have the Frankish sources, Gregory of Tours and the Liber Historiae Francorum. These sources are the ones that document the first Viking style raids in 521 AD, led by someone called Clohilaicus, who would be Hygelac from the poem Beowulf, king of the Geats, who are often confused with these with the Danes in these texts. Actually, there is a lot of confusion regarding the names and differences between these peoples. Unfortunately, it is told that Hygelac was killed during a raid on the Lower Rhine. We also have the Venerable Bede as a source, writing in about 730, and he wrote the Historia Ecclesiastica, and here he identified the three most powerful Germanic nations invading Britain in the 5th century: the Saxons, Angles, and the Jutes. And he explicitly identified the Angles as Scandinavian peoples originated from the region of Schleswig. What he categorizes, though, was likely much more obscure and complicated than these very neatly organized groups. As a matter of fact, I think to understand this very chaotic early history, one should view Scandinavia not as this group of isolated tribes, but rather as a hive of communities that periodically swarmed south, driven by land hunger or perhaps also internal unrest and so on. And this would have happened long before the Viking Age proper began, but already we can see some characteristics that are going to be perfected, so to speak, during the Viking Age. So, as we can see, the beginnings of the Viking Age were not a sudden bolt from the blue, but rather the result of centuries of social, cultural, environmental, technological evolution, and so on. While the period is traditionally dated to have begun in 793, the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, historical and archaeological evidence actually shows that the Viking phenomenon was in motion much earlier, and particularly in Eastern Europe, as we shall see. To go Viking, at vara I Viking, was a form of work and livelihood, a route to prosperity, or at least to subsistence. It had three core components: the raiding, trading, and seizure of land, which often intertwined, and not only before the Viking Age, but also long after it. One can move back from the onset of the Viking movement shortly before 800 without any sense of very deep rupture. Also, to the deliberate development of seafaring skills among Scandinavian peoples and the eastward expansion of the Swedes into the Baltic regions soon after 700. And these movements rest upon earlier movements in the migration period, but also much earlier in the Bronze Age, and so on. So we do have a sense of change, but also a sense of continuity. At the same time, it is important not to regard even the most familiar northern kings as rulers of nations in any modern sense. The kingdoms formed in Denmark at the start of the 9th century, in Sweden some 50 to 100 years later, and in Norway shortly before 900, more or less, they were clearly larger, stronger, and more suggestive of future developments, political developments, than the petty kingdoms and independent chiefdoms and lordships that preceded them. But in no way are they to be compared with the national states that only developed in the late medieval periods. In the words of historian Gwyn Jones, they were rather personal aggrandizements of territory and wealth based on sea power, unstable in nature and eccentric in duration. The expansion was made possible by critical advances in shipbuilding, most notably in the 8th century with the introduction of the sail to Scandinavian hulls and also the development of a stable keel. Clinker built ships, that is essentially when the edges of the planks are placed one on top of the other. They had shallow drafts, and this enabled Vikings to land almost on any beach and navigate very far inland up the shallow rivers. And this provided a massive advantage, tactical advantage, to conduct surprise attacks. This allowed for swift, long distance maritime travel that the previous road vessels couldn't simply achieve. Economic incentives also played a primary role, and I mean by that the fact that by the 8th century, Scandinavians had tapped into the Silk Roads in the east, establishing trade routes that brought a flood of Islamic silver dirhams into the north. Human trafficking and the export of northern furs were also central pillars of Viking Age economy from its inception. The practice of polygyny, so having multiple wives and concubines among the elites, might have created a surplus of unmarried young men who sought wealth and status abroad to improve their marriage prospects. But generally speaking, beyond that, one of the best ways in that time to make a name for yourself and gather fortune was to grow abroad. It would have definitely increased your chances to climb the social ladder. We have laws of inheritance that often favored the firstborn son, which essentially mean that the younger brothers would have ended up landless and they were more or less forced to go search for fortune elsewhere, as well as for Odal, that would be the hereditary land. So you didn't have it at home, you had to go fix things for yourself somewhere else. Power in Scandinavia at the same time was not really bound to static territorial boundaries. It was rather personalized, so built on personal relationships between chieftains and their warriors. So that means to maintain a local retinue called the hird, a leader was required to constantly and increasingly provide prestigious gifts and also organize lavish feasts. And this created a political need for portable wealth, such as silver and slaves, which could only be satisfied through expanded trade and raiding. The 8th century also saw the ascent of the Særkonungar, so sea kings, whose authority was based on maritime military prowess rather than owning land. These leaders would compete to secure marine passageways and control the lucrative trade in Arctic raw materials. Powerful chieftains began to consolidate some principalities into larger units, often by seizing the legal jurisdiction traditionally held by the local assemblies known as the things. So, this means that disenfranchised elites who lost power place at home frequently turned to overseas expeditions in order to recuperate or increase their status. Contrary to the Western centric view, especially present in the written sources, the earliest physical evidence of a Viking raid actually comes from the Salme ship burials in Estonia, dating back to about 750 AD. These ship burials contained the remains of 41 Swedish warriors from the region of Lake Mälaren who died in quite a violent conflict. The presence of bejeweled swords of animals such as hawks and hundreds of gaming pieces suggests this was a high status diplomatic or mercantile mission that apparently turned into a bloody massacre, proving that the armed Scandinavian fleets were active in the east at least 40 years before the raiding began in the west. The eastern expansion was anchored by the establishment of Staraja Ladoga, known in Norse as Aldejuborg. So around the 750, again, this was situated on the Volkhov River and it acted as a sort of polyethnic melting pot where Scandinavians, Slavs, and Finns and Balts would have interacted. It served as a vital frontier outpost, allowing the Northmen to control the entrance to the vast Russian river arteries. The primary catalyst for the Eastern movement was the thirst for silver, the silver rush, specifically the Islamic dirhams flooding out of the newly established Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 762. By the late 8th century, Scandinavians essentially filled a niche as middlemen, exchanging Arctic and northern commodities, primarily slaves, but also high quality furs of marten and squirrel and sable and so on, for the silver and silk of the Orient. Those who navigated these routes eventually became known as the Rus, a term likely derived from the Old Norse roa, which means to row, or the Old Swedish rotsmen, so men of the rowing way. Either way, it's in the same semantic area. By the mid 9th century, the Rus moved from being transient traders to established rulers, and this political shift is traditionally marked by the so-called calling of the Varangians in 862, when the chieftain called Rurik supposedly established himself in Holmgarder in Novgorod, followed by his successor Oleg, who seized Kiev to be closer to the markets of the great city Miklagard, Constantinople. In the West, the transition to violence began at the end of the 8th century. In 789, three ships of Northmen arrived in Dorset, according to an entry in the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. When the local reeve mistook them for merchants and tried to just lead them to the royal manor, they killed him. And this is a very important detail because it showed that these people had already established trading links with the British Isles as well. The Lindisfarne raid in 793 on the St. Cuthbert Monastery was particularly shocking to the Christian world because the site was, of course, considered venerable and sacred. For the Vikings, however, undefended monasteries like Lindisfarne or Jarrow or Iona and so on, they were essentially like sitting ducks that possessed vast quantities of gold, silver, and also potential slaves. By the 830s, the raids escalated to targets like the wealthy Frisian mart of Dorestad and the mouth of the Loire in Francia, which had also been known to the Vikings who had established trading links to them. The Vikings seem to have possessed an incredible intuition for political instability abroad. While the East provided raw materials for trade, the West was rather perceived as a repository of portable and high value plunder. So we can see both push and pull factors acting out here. The onset of the Viking raids in the West was to an extent influenced by the rise of royal power within Scandinavia, in the sense that powerful chieftains and early kings consolidated territory in the late 8th century, and this meant an incipient centralization of power that also suppressed internal rivalries and secured domestic trade routes, but at the same time, it created redundant military capacity. So, warriors engaged previously in local feuding or domestic piracy were forced to seek alternative hunting grounds to maintain their status and livelihoods. Regional sea kings established peace arrangements with long distance traders, providing safety in exchange for tolls. And this effectively squeezed out independent pirates from home waters, pushing them to explore the western route across the Northern Sea. On the other hand, events such as the Frankish civil wars following the death of Louis the Pious in 840, and also the fragmented nature of England, provided a power vacuum that almost invited large scale invasions from the north. Speaking of Francia, the written sources, which are very biased, tend to perceive Scandinavian chieftains and kings in contradictory ways. Take, for example, Siegfried, known to the court of the Emperor Charlemagne for sheltering a Saxon rebel, Widukind, labeled as a rex rather than a dux, which marked the Danish ruler as belonging to a slightly different political class from a Carolingian perspective. At the same time, we have contemporary poems written by Peter of Pisa and Paul the Deacon mocking him as pompous, savage, and uncivilized. However, this very hostility suggests that he was seen as a serious opponent who supported resistance to Carolingian power and expansion during the Saxon Wars. Gothred, who was Sigfred's son or brother, succeeded him around the year 800 and proved to be a very able and cautious ruler. He avoided direct submission to Charlemagne, built up military strength, and actively resisted Frankish expansion north of the Elbe River, also reinforced the southern border, including with work such as the Denewirke. Although portrayed in the Frankish annals as aggressive and arrogant, his actions can be read as defensive responses. The Carolingian sources, especially Charlemagne's biographer Einhard, depict Gottfried as boastful, savage, and even a mad ruler, drawing on classical literary tropes, contrasting him with the very just and civilized Charlemagne. Gothric's kingdom, on the other hand, is increasingly understood by modern historiography as an incipient state reacting to Frankish pressure and also selectively imitating Carolingian models of power, such as supporting trading hubs. Rulers at the time also sought to monopolize wealth by founding and protecting specialized trading towns like Ribe and Hedeby. These were not really organic settlements, but rather deliberate creations powerful chieftains designed in order to centralize economic activity and extract wealth. These sites, often referred to as gateway communities, allowed the elites to act as intermediaries in a vast international network linking the North Atlantic to Western Europe, the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. Founded in about 710 AD, Ribe initially functioned as a seasonal marketplace before being reorganized in a more permanent and planned community between 770 and 780. Its layout featured a series of regular long plots, about 6 to 8 meters wide, arranged along a main street, a structure that survived largely unaltered for about 150 years. Hedeby was likely founded by King Godfred in 808, and was strategically located at a bottleneck on the Jutland Peninsula. To ensure its dominance, Godfred destroyed the rival Slavic trading center of Redik and forcibly transferred the merchants to Hedeby under his personal patronage. Rulers also exercised authority through several specific administrative and economic tools. The first one being, of course, taxation and tolls. The primary motivation for controlling these sites was the collection of landing fees, custom duties, and also market taxes. In this way, kings effectively monetized their geographical advantages, such as Hedeby's portage possibility that allowed ships to bypass the dangerous Skagerrak Strait. Chieftains and kings rarely resided in the towns themselves. Instead, they appointed a royal bailiff or steward, some sort of prefectus, to supervise the market, preside over the assemblies, and collect land rents. By the early 8th century, central power was established in Ribe, controlling the coinage, issuing standardized silver sciatas, and potentially prohibiting the usage of other currencies. Anonymous imitations of Carolingian coins were later struck in Hedeby from around 825. The control of these emporia essentially turned kings into entrepreneurs, the businessmen of the northern arc of trade, by protecting these sites with the ramparts, palisades, or sea barriers. They would guarantee the safe passage of merchants in exchange for a monopoly on luxury goods. So this means that the elites gained the first choice of prestigious imports, such as Frankish wine, Indian carnelian, and so on, which were absolutely essential in this competitive gift giving economy that secured the loyalty of the warrior retinues. By the mid 9th century, the nature of the Viking movement shifted from sporadic hit and run raids to large scale military campaigns. This era was marked by what we might deem as hydrarchies, uniquely mobile pirate polities that operated as states in their own right. This concept, used by historians like Neil Price and Christian Koymans, originally coined in the 17th century to describe the radical structures of Atlantic mariners, may also be useful to understand what was happening in the Viking Age and to explain how Viking forces could exert widespread maritime control without being part of, let's say, a formal and very centralized state. Mirroring the mythical Hydra of Greek legend, a hierarchy has no single head or monarch with whom an enemy can negotiate. If one leader or head is killed, the rest of the organization remains quite functional and also dangerous, often generating new leadership in its place. Viking armies, such as the Great Heathen Army, were not really unified national forces, but rather confederacies of independent shipborne hosts known as liv in Old Norse. These smaller units joined together for large scale operations and then split apart to overwinter in different regions according to their own choices. These groups were held together by oath driven relationships and short term contractual bonds for mutual benefit rather than traditional national or tribal allegiances. This allowed them to operate effectively as states in their own right while remaining very flexible and transient. The hierarchy model allowed Vikings to engage in longboat diplomacy, using their maritime mobility to strike suddenly, extract tribute, like the Danegeld, and then vanish or relocate completely to a different base. This structure was a response to the political consolidation occurring through Scandinavia, as it provided a home for redundant military capacity that no longer fit into the rising homeland kingdoms. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in the British Isles in 865 and their subsequent wintering at Repton in 873-74 signaled a move toward permanent settlement and the political conquest of the English kingdoms. To understand this sort of event, think of Vikings as floating communities, sort of like a wooden highway that allowed the North to effectively bridge the gap between the freezing Arctic and the riches of the East and the West.